Alright everybody, so this week we're going over the rest of the axial skeleton. So if you remember, the skull is part of the axial skeleton, but there were so many different little bones and structures in the skull that we covered it in its own section. So now we're just going to finish up the axial skeleton, mostly talking about the vertebrae, the sacrum, the sternum, stuff like that. If you remember, we do have a list that we're going to follow. So this list is found at the beginning of the chapter, but you don't need to know every single one of these structures. So this is the list. If you're using the new book, it's on page 97 and 98. If you're using the old book, it's on page 95, 96. And you don't need to know every single one of these structures. Remember, there's a modified version of this list that is on our Canvas site that has crossed out the ones you don't need to know. So I have them highlighted here, the ones that we do need to know. Alright, so make sure you have that list pulled out and you're following along with it, because I'm going to go in order of this list, going through all of these different bones. Alright, so we're going to talk about all the vertebrae first, and there are three different categories of your vertebrae, or three different sections, I should say, of your vertebrae. We have cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. So the cervical vertebrae are the vertebrae that are found in your neck area, while thoracic, which you might be able to guess, is the ones that are in your rib cage, or the ones that hold your ribs. And then below that we have our lumbar, which are really thick, big vertebrae that are really there to help with stability and to support our weight. Okay, so you will have to know how many of each one of these vertebrae we have. Alright, and your book uses this analogy of times of day that you eat to help you remember how many we have of each vertebrae. So they say that you might eat at 7 a.m., 12 p.m., and then 5 p.m. for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. A lot of people don't eat those times, but it's just an easy, helpful way to remember how many of each type of vertebrae you have. So we do have 7 cervical vertebrae, or 7 vertebrae in our neck. Then we have 12 vertebrae in our thoracic region, and then we have 5 lumbar that are near the base of the spine. So just so you can see the 3 different types of vertebrae. Alright, so what we have here is a cervical, thoracic, and a lumbar vertebrae. And just looking at these, you can tell they're pretty different from one another. However, they all do have structures that are in common. So these structures that we're going to go through here at first, you can find in all types of vertebrae. Now, what they look like might be slightly different depending on what region of the spine you're looking at. Okay, so some of the things you should be able to notice that they have in common is they all have this spine that's coming out the back. They all have this central foramen that is going down. This is where your spinal cord is going to go through. And they all have a body. Now again, we have the spine coming out the back. We have this central foramen where the spinal cord is going to go down. And again, you have a body for cervical, and same thing for the lumbar. Alright, so how can we tell one from another? Alright, so one way you could tell cervical, actually cervical is pretty easy to identify because they have extra foramen that other bones don't have. So all seven of your cervical vertebrae have these transverse foramen on each side of the vertebrae. You see this extra foramen there and extra foramen there, and you notice none of the other ones have that. The thoracic doesn't have it, and the lumbar does not have it. So that is easy to identify. Look for those extra foramen, and you're done. However, when it comes to thoracic and the lumbar, it gets a little bit more challenging because they do look more similar. They don't have those extra foramen like the cervical do. So the best way to tell one from another is to look at the body of the vertebrae. You can tell the thoracic is smaller, lumbar is a little bigger, but look at the body. The body is much wider on the lumbar than it is on the thoracic. And an easy way to remember the thoracic is the smaller one is because since it has a thinner body, it almost looks like a heart for its body. So we have this heart shape here. And where do you find your heart but in the thoracic cavity? So that's an easy connection that you can make, that the heart-shaped body is part of the thoracic region. Okay, so getting into these structures that all 3 of these have. The first one on your list is called a pedicle. And your pedicle are 2 arm-like bars that are helping make up this central foramen. So I'm going to talk about this foramen here in a second and what it's called. I'm just showing you that there is a foramen there. I'm going to use the lumbar because it's easier. It's much bigger and easier to see these structures. Alright, but you have 4 bars that are making up this foramen. You have one here, one here, and one here. So 1, 2, 3, 4 coming together to make up that foramen. Well, the two down here are your pedicles. Alright, so I'm going to take this string right here and tie it around the pedicle so you know what I'm talking about. So putting it through that foramen, and now the string is wrapping the pedicle. So it's that bar right there all the way around. And you have another one on the other side since we are symmetrical. Alright, an easy way to remember this one is if you flip it upside down and kind of ignore the rest of this, it almost looks like little feet sticking down. Alright, the pedicles, pedi meaning foot, looks like little feet sticking out of whatever this body is. Alright, so there's your pedicles. Okay, so with the foramen with these pedicles making up the foramen, we also have this bar here and this bar here. Alright, we call these lamina, and again I'm going to take the string and tie it around just one of the lamina. Alright, there is a lamina. That is another bar that is helping make up that central foramen. So lamina there. The string is going all the way around the lamina. And then you have another one on this side as well. So you have two lamina, two pedicles, and together they're making up this hole. That is right in the center of the vertebrae. Now as you can see on the thoracic, let this camera focus real quick. On thoracic we have the same thing, so two pedicles, two lamina, and then on the cervical, same thing. Harder to see, but two pedicles, two lamina. Alright, so number 3 on the list is this process that is sticking out the back of the spine. Alright, so each one of your vertebrae has this process sticking out. This is called your spinous process. Remember, spine in our bone terms meaning really sharp process. That's that process right there. And these are the things that you feel sticking out of your back. So if you run your fingers down your spine, you feel all those bumps sticking out of your back. It's each one of these spinous processes sticking out of all your vertebrae. And again, we have it on the thoracic, we have it on the lumbar, right there, and we even have it on the cervical. It's just much smaller, but we have one. Alright, sticking out the back. So spinous process sticking out the back there. And then this foramen that is going down the center of these bones where your spinal cord is going to run through is called your vertebral foramen. So an easy name, it's named right after the bones, so vertebral foramen. So when these are all stacked up, remember these are from different regions, so I'm not going to put them on top of one another. But when they're all stacked up, you'll have this nice long channel for your spinal cord to run through. Okay, so the next structures that you need to know are the processes that are sticking out the sides of the bones. So we have a process here, and we have a process here. Alright, here, here. Alright, and if you remember our planes, what was the plane that cuts across the body? Well, that was the transverse plane. Same name here. These are called transverse processes because they're processes sticking out the sides of the vertebrae. And again, we have them here on the thoracic, we have them here on the lumbar, sticking out the sides, and we even have them here on the cervical. Not as easily defined on the cervicals because they're so much more tiny, but we have them. Okay. And then finally, the last structure you need to know for all the vertebrae is the body itself. So that's how we determine the thoracic from the lumbar, but another name for the body is centrum. All right, the center mass of this bone is your centrum. Okay, so now we're going to talk about special parts to certain vertebrae. So the first two special vertebrae we're going to talk about is your atlas and your axis. These are your first two cervical vertebrae, and they look much different. Alright, so remember we have 7 cervical vertebrae, but this is 1, this is 2, they look different, and then 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are going to look more like this one. Okay, so the first one, which is C1, cervical 1, is called your atlas, and that's the term that we're going to use here, atlas. But if you know the story, the Greek mythology of Atlas, it's kind of easy to remember. In Greek mythology, Atlas was the one that had to carry the universe or the world on his shoulders. If you've ever been to New York City to Rockefeller Center, they have a statue of Atlas out front. It's a person holding the world on their back. Well, that's where the name of this bone came from, because the world that it's holding is your skull. So this is the first vertebrae that's going to hold your skull on top of it. Alright, so we're going to start with Atlas first, and then we'll get into Axis. Alright, so with the Atlas, there are two arches. If you look straight down at it, you have that vertebral foramen right in the center. You have two transverse foramen on each side. Alright, so there are two arches that you need to be able to identify, a posterior arch and an anterior arch. Now remember, anterior is towards the front, while posterior is towards the back. Can you tell, just by looking at this, which one is the posterior arch? Well, a lot of students make this assumption that the shorter one should go in back, and that is not true. The shorter arch is actually going in the front. This longer arch is the one in the back, and you can even see a little trace of a spinous process sticking out the back here, because that's one of the structures all vertebrae have. Well, Atlas is very reduced, and there it is right there. So the bigger arch is your posterior arch, so this should be facing behind, while your anterior arch is smaller and should be facing forward, like this. Okay, so the next structure that you need to identify is the facet for the dens. Alright, and the facet for the dens, which I'm going to show you what the dens is here in a second, but the facet for the dens is a flat spot that is right on the inside of the anterior arch. The dens is a little piece of bone that sticks up, and it attaches to the facet for dens on the Atlas and allows your head to swivel. Alright, so I'm going to show you the dens when we get into the axis bone, but for the Atlas, you just need to know the facet for the dens is right on the inside of the anterior arch. Okay, so moving on to cervical number 2, which is your axis. So your axis is the word that we're going to use in this class. Again, looks very different than a lot of the other vertebrae that you have. Alright, but does have a lot of similar characteristics. It has a spinous process sticking out the back, so you know this is posterior. You have a vertebral foramen where your spinal cord is going to go through. Alright, the one weird structure it has is this little nub that is sticking out the top of it. This is your dens. So your dens is this nub of bone that's sticking straight up. And the dens is on the anterior side of the bone, and it is like that because it needs to match up with the anterior arch of your Atlas. So axis dens goes into dens of facet on the Atlas. And that's where it sits, just like that. And it swivels, allowing you to make a no gesture with your head. Alright, this is why we can turn our heads left and right, is because of this joint that is being made between the dens of the axis and the facet for dens of the Atlas. So that's the only structure you need to know for axis. Just make sure you can identify it and know what the dens is doing for your body. Okay, so next on the list is just general characteristics that cervical foramen have, or I'm sorry, cervical vertebrae have, and remember your cervical vertebrae or your neck vertebrae. So this is true for Atlas and Axis as well. They have these structures. So the two that you need to know, one is your transverse foramen. So I've already talked about this. Your transverse foramen are these foramen off to the sides. All right, cervical vertebrae have this, thoracic and lumbar do not, but it's at the base of your transverse processes. So that's where the name's coming from, transverse foramen. These extra foramen right there. Alright, and the other structure you need to know that all cervical vertebrae have is the strange shape it makes at the spine. This one is a little broken off. There should be another little nub right here. And it's called a bifid spinous process. And what is that? That's really meaning that it forks like a snake's tongue. A snake's tongue is a bifurcated tongue. That just means it forks like this. Well, it forks here as well. Going back to the axis, you can clearly see that forking, that bifid spinous process. And even with the Atlas, you could barely see it, but it's there. Very small bifid spinous process. Alright, so that's it for the cervical vertebrae. So again, you need to know the Atlas, the special structures on the Atlas, the Axis special structures, and the cervical, and what cervical vertebrae all have in common. Then you need to be able to identify thoracic. There's no special structures on here that you will need to know. The only thing you really need to be able to do is to determine a thoracic vertebrae versus a lumbar vertebrae. And I've already discussed that at the beginning of this video, so it's really with the body, and the thoracic body is more of a heart shape, while the lumbar is more of a kidney bean shaped, it's wider. All right. So remember, we have 12 thoracic making up the thoracic cavity, or part of the thoracic cavity, and then we have our lumbar, which is 5, that is helping support our weight. And that's why they're so much bigger. Okay, so the next bone we're going to cover is your sacrum. Your sacrum, it sits at the base of your spine, so all your vertebrae are coming off this way, and attaches to your os coxa, which are your hip bones. All right, so you have 2 os coxa, they attach right here. So this is right in the center of your hip. This is part of your axial skeleton, while your os coxa are part of your appendicular skeleton. All right, this is a very odd looking bone, right? But what you might have noticed is that this is actually a bunch of vertebrae that have fused together. All right, you can even see the fusion marks right here. So this was one vertebrae, this was another vertebrae, this is another vertebrae, all the way down. All right, and you can see where they fused. So your sacrum is actually a bunch of vertebrae that fused together. So because of that, it has a lot of similar structures to the rest of your vertebrae. Okay, so one of the structures that you should be able to determine is your sacral canal, which is this hole that is going straight down the sacrum. It goes all the way down and comes out the bottom here. All right, I'm using Q-tips to kind of indicate all this stuff. All right, so this is your sacral canal, and what your sacral canal is all those vertebral foramen fused together. All right, so now you have a long canal instead of just a foramen. So sacral canal. You do have nerves that run through this, including your sciatic nerve. So your spinal cord ends around or in your lumbar region, and then it's just nerves that run down from there. So your nerves are actually running through the sacral canal. All right, the next structure is called your sacral hiatus. And here you see the roof of the sacral canal. You see there's a roof on it going through the canal. Imagine you're walking through this tunnel. You have a ceiling, you have a ceiling, you have a ceiling, and then at some point you lose the ceiling. You could still walk through the tunnel, but there's no roof to this tunnel anymore. It's like the roof took a break. This is what your sacral hiatus is. It's where the roof of the sacral canal ends, and you just have the walls left of the canal. So we call this the sacral hiatus right there. All right, and the next structure you need to know is this ridge that's coming off the back. It looks like a mountain range going straight down the center. All right, so everything you need to know is right in the name. This is called your medial, right? Medial towards the midline. Medial sacral crest. Remember, crest is a ridge, right? Here is your medial sacral crest. And you might be able to tell what your medial sacral crest is. Well, it's all those spinous processes of the vertebrae fused together. So you have a bunch of spinous processes, because this is a bunch of vertebrae fused together, that make a crest now because they're all attached to each other. So medial sacral crest, right there. Okay, so the next thing we need to talk about is your foramina. So you have multiple foramina. So foramina is just plural of foramen. Foramen's one, foramina is plural. And you have foramina on this side, and you have foramina on this side. Now, looking at the camera, or looking at this video, you might think this is all just one foramen. Saying, hey, Mr. Reynolds, just go straight through. Why is this not considered one foramen? Well, it's because it actually doesn't go straight through. It's all connected to the central canal. So nerves are running through your central canal, and some are coming out the back, and some are coming out the front of these foramina. All right, so everything you need to know in the name is right there. So you have anterior sacral foramina and posterior sacral foramina. So the real challenge here is which side is the front and what side is the back. Well, this is the back because of the medial sacral crest. If you remember, the sacral crest are really just your spinous processes of the vertebrae that are fused together, which means this needs to face posterior, while the flatter, smoother section is facing anterior. So this is more towards the front of the person, while this is more towards the back of the person. So here on this side would be your posterior sacral foramina, while on this side is your anterior sacral foramina. Okay, so two more things that you need to identify on this bone. One is your sacral base. Your sacral base really is the top of the sacrum. So here is your sacral base up here. It is home base for the last lumbar vertebrae. Remember, you have lumbar vertebrae coming down here. Well, the last one, L5, is going to sit on top of your sacrum. So this is the base where it's going to sit. So if I take a lumbar vertebrae, imagine this is L5, it's going to sit right there nice and snug. All right, so this is the base, the sacral base. And the last structure you need to identify is the transverse lines. Well, transverse meaning going across, and their lines, well, these are your transverse lines right here where the vertebrae have fused together. You can see the fusion line right there, right there, right there. So these are your transverse lines of the sacrum where the vertebrae have fused together. I don't know how difficult it is to see on the camera, so I'm just pointing it out one more time. All right, and that is it for the sacrum. All right, the next thing we're talking about is your sternum, which is making up the plate that's in the front of your chest. So if you kind of touch the front of your chest, that's what you're feeling as a bone that's helping protect a lot of the organs and hold your ribs together. All right, so it is a narrow bone coming straight down like this, and it has hyaline cartilage that comes off of it that helps hold the ribs to the sternum. All right, so you have ribs that are coming off your vertebrae, wrapping around to the front of you, and then being held to the sternum by this hyaline cartilage. Okay, so there's a few structures you should be able to identify with this. Okay, so just pulling out one of the pictures from the book here. All right, you see your sternum right here in the front, holding ribs that are wrapping around towards the back where your vertebrae are. All right, so one thing you could be able to notice with this, it almost looks like a tie, like a tie you would wear with a suit, right? So you have this almost like a necktie right here. That is this bone. All right, so this might help you remember some of the structures on here. So your sternum is actually two bones fused together. You can see a fusion line right here. All right, so you have this bigger, wider bone up here, looking like the knot of the necktie, and then you have this longer part right here which looks like the rest of the necktie. Well, one way that I have remembered this name, if you think about who wears neckties more, men or women, well, males usually wear neckties more. All right, it helps to remember the name of the knot of the necktie. All right, so this bone right here is called your manubrium. All right, so that's just a little trick to remember the name of this one. All right, since men wear neckties more, it's easy to remember. The knot is your manubrium. Then the rest of the bone, coming out this way, this is going down, all right, is called your gladiolus. All right, that word might sound familiar to you because it is the same root word as gladiator. Gladio means sword in Latin. A gladiator is a person who holds sword. A gladiolus is a bone that looks like a sword. So that's where this name is coming from. So we have a manubrium and we have a gladiolus right there. Okay, so the next thing you should be able to identify is this extra structure down here. This is called your xiphoid process. It's this process that's making up the tip of the sword. This isn't actually bone, it's actually hyaline cartilage. All right, but that's your xiphoid process at the very tip of the gladiolus, so xiphoid process. Then you have a few notches you need to know, and that's all the way back here up at the manubrium. Now remember, this is like this in the person. So you have a notch right in the center. Let the camera focus on. All right, so you have a notch right in the center, and then you have two notches on the side. Well, to know the difference between the two is actually pretty easy. If you think about what bones connect to the sternum. We haven't covered these bones yet, but there are two bones that come down here and another one coming down here that rest in this notch and this notch. These are your collarbones, also known as your clavicles. So that is where the name of this notch right here is coming from. This is called your clavicular notch because your clavicle sits in it, just like that. And then you have this one in the center called your jugular notch, and it's where your jugular vein is going to run through. Okay, so the next bone we're going to cover is your rib. Looking at the rib, looking at it, it doesn't look like it has many features on it, but there are a couple structures you do need to be able to identify. There's two ends to the rib. One is going more posterior, connecting to the vertebrae, while the other one's going towards the anterior, connecting to the sternum through that cartilage that I showed you with the sternum. And being able to tell one side from another is really important to identifying the structures of this bone. So I'm going to try to get the camera to focus. Let's see if it works. Alright, so if you notice at one end of the bone, it's more lumpy. It's got more going on over here versus the other end of the bone. That looks like somebody just chopped it off with a saw. It's nice and smooth. There's really not much going on here. It looks like somebody just lopped it off. Well, the lumpy end is all lumpy for a reason. Alright, this is helping make joints with your vertebrae. So the lumpy end is what's going towards the posterior, connected to the vertebrae. You have ligaments and stuff holding this joint together. Well, on the smooth end is smooth because it's just hyaline cartilage attached to it. Alright, so hyaline cartilage coming off right here, which eventually goes to the sternum. Okay, so coming back to the lumpy end. The first structure you need to identify is the head of the rib. So this is not the best example, but you can still see it. This is a model rib, it's not a real rib. So you can see how it gets narrow right here. This is considered the neck of the rib, while the wider part towards the tip is called the head. So the head sits on the neck. That's how you tell the head. Okay, so we have head. So we have head of rib, neck of rib, and then if you come down a little further, you're going to see this round process that's sticking out right here. Alright, nice and round, small. This is your rib tubercle. Alright, your rib tubercle right here. Alright, so it's nice and rough and it helps make up the joints that are attaching the rib to your vertebrae. Alright, so it's very close to the head. So rib tubercle. Okay, then going to the rest of the rib right here, the center mass of the rib is your body, and that's true for any bone. The center mass where most of the weight is called the body of the bone, so here's your body of the rib right here. I'm grabbing it by the body. If you look at the inferior side, the bottom of the rib, you're going to notice a groove. I'm trying to get it to come up on camera, you might be able to see it right here. Now remember, a groove is like a long carve out. You can see it pretty defined right here in the camera, but it goes all the way down the rib. Alright, this is your rib groove, also known as your costal groove. And whenever you hear the word costal, it's really referring to ribs. So costal groove right here. And the last thing you need to identify is, again, I already pointed this out, where the vertebral end is the end that is going towards the vertebrae versus your sternal end. Remember, the sternal end, it looks like it got cut off because it's nice and smooth because it's attaching to hyaline cartilage or cartilage that's attached to the sternum. Well, this is directly touching bone. That's why it's all lumpy, because it needs to make a joint. Well, here it doesn't need to make a joint, it just needs to attach to hyaline cartilage. Alright, so that's it for the rib. Okay, so the last bone that we need to cover is your coccyx. Your coccyx is your tailbone. We still have a tail, it's just super reduced in humans. However, it's similar to any other animal tail, it's just really tiny in us. And your coccyx sits at the base of your sacrum. So remember, your sacrum is helping make up the hip. This is the front of the sacrum. You have hip bones coming off here and here. Well, right here is where the coccyx would be, a little triangle down here. I don't have one as an example, so I have to use the picture in the book to show you the structures. Okay, so let's see if we can get this to focus. Alright, so again, here is your tailbone, your coccyx. Alright, so this is the anterior side, this is the posterior side. There are two structures you need to identify. One are these processes sticking out the sides of your coccyx. And looking at the coccyx, you might be able to tell what it is. It's actually a bunch of vertebrae that are just reduced, really tiny vertebrae that are fused together. Very similar to how the sacrum's made. It's a bunch of vertebrae fused together. Well, if these are similar to vertebrae, you might be able to guess what these processes sticking out the sides are. These are your transverse processes, just like we saw in the vertebrae. So transverse process, transverse process. Then looking at the posterior side, here, let's see if we can get this a little brighter. Okay, so looking at the posterior side of your coccyx, you might see a little horn there and a horn there. Alright, so you see this word pop up a lot in anatomy. It's called cornu. Do just like we saw in the stratum corneum. Cornu means horns. All right, so you have these little tiny bull horns that are sticking off the top of your coccyx. These are called coccygeal cornu, horns of the coccyx, right there in the name. So these are the two structures you need to know. Your coccygeal cornu, which are these two structures sticking up, little horns, and then your transverse processes that are sticking out the sides. All right, so that's it for this week. That's all the structures and bones that you need to be able to identify for the quiz. So this is us finishing up the axial skeleton, and next week we are going to start on the appendicular skeleton, which is your arms and legs and everything they're attached to. All right, so hopefully this video helps you out with identifying the structures of the axial skeleton.